Hello and welcome to Disastrous History. Today we're going to talk about the deadliest disaster in Great Lakes history, known as the White Hurricane. It has several names: the White Hurricane, the Great Storm of 1913, the Big Blow, Freshwater Fury, whatever you want to call it. Pretty much if you include 1913, people will know what you were talking about. But the funny thing is it wasn't one specific storm. It was actually two separate storms that impacted the Great Lakes in back-to-back days. And we'll get to what I mean there in a minute. But first, I want to go over what the Great Lakes are. So if you don't know what the Great Lakes are, they are a set of 5 lakes up here in southern Canada and northern United States. It's these 5 lakes right here. Now, they are freshwater lakes, and they are incredibly large. It is hard to explain just how large they are. They contain 92% of the fresh water in North America, and about 20% of the fresh water across the entire world is located in these 5 lakes. Now, these lakes are, this one right here is Ontario. This is Lake Ontario. This is Lake Erie. This is Lake Huron, this is Lake Michigan, and this is Lake Superior. Now, Lake Superior is the largest of the Great Lakes and contains by itself approximately 10% of the fresh water across the entire world. Something like 3 quadrillion gallons of water are located in Lake Superior. They are absolutely massive. Many people like to call them inland seas, essentially, because they are so large. This is not like a normal lake where you go out and you can see the other side. You cannot see the other side of Lake Superior or Lake Michigan or Lake Ontario or any of them. They are absolutely massive. Now, the thing with Great Lakes, if you've ever listened to the song The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot, you've heard of the Gales of November or the Witches of November or any other number of names that they come across. And it's basically there's really bad storms on the Great Lakes during November. But nobody ever explains exactly why there are these incredibly strong storms over the lakes in November. So let's get into it. So in order to understand exactly why the storms over the Great Lakes are so much worse in November, we first need to understand something called a mid-latitude cyclone. It is essentially any storm that occurs from basically here in Canada up to northern Mexico. That's the low-pressure systems that move across the United States. If you hear people talk about troughs or shortwave troughs or anything like that, they are talking about a mid-latitude cyclone. In early spring into early summer in the traditional Tornado Alley down here from North Dakota down into Texas and Oklahoma, and then Waffle House Alley, as I like to call it, through the deep south here, and then up this direction, as well as over here in Hoosier Alley, and then there's Carolinas Alley right here, and then there's a New England Alley up here. These are where you get your tornado outbreaks during the spring, usually, March, April, May, and sometimes June. That is generally caused by mid-latitude cyclones that move across the United States. Now, what we need to understand about why these form is where the system is getting its strength from. So, down here, you get warm, moist air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, moving this direction. You get cold, dry air coming down from Canada and the Rocky Mountains this direction. And where these two meet is generally, for the most part, those winds blow opposite each other, right? So here, let me show you real quick. Okay, so what we have here is we have 2 air masses. We have this one on the right side here is the warm air mass that's coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And then we have this one over here is the cold air mass that's coming from the Rockies and Canada and all that. The big end here points north, so our cold air is north. Now, where these two meet, the warm air usually rises and goes up over the cold air, and the cold air usually goes underneath the warm air. And usually what happens where these two meet is your winds will blow parallel to each other, parallel along what is called the isobar for this area. So you'll have winds that go opposite each other, like so. So they'll be blowing east-west, so this one will be blowing east, this one will be blowing west, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. However, occasionally you will have an upper-level disturbance, such as a trough or a shortwave trough usually that comes through that has a lower pressure. And what that does is it begins to force some of the air at the bottom. So you've got, let's just draw this real quick. You've got here. In the middle, you have, let's say, a column of air, right? In order to get a low pressure system in a system, in order to get a low pressure, you have to have more convergence or divergence aloft than you do convergence at surface level. So in all low pressure systems, there's convergence and there's divergence. Up aloft, high in the atmosphere, you're going to have divergence. Down on surface level, you're going to have convergence. Basically, where air is going together, divergence is where air is separating. As long as there is more divergence up top than there is down at the surface level, this low will continue to deepen because cold air sinks and it will get lower and lower and lower. And as that warm air rises, it will continue to make it get lower and lower and lower. That's great. That's awesome. What does that have to do with a cyclone? So you get your low pressure that forms from your disturbance. And off of this low pressure, you develop two fronts. You have your warm front, like this. Your warm front's moving in the direction of the symbols. And then you have your cold front, which is usually somewhere south of the low pressure front. And it's usually moving in the way of the symbols. What happens here is you get your warm air from the Gulf of Mexico down here in this portion right here. It's called the warm sector. It's warm, moist air. Back here, you have your cold air from the north, your cold, dry air from the north coming down along this direction. And because in the northern hemisphere, wind rotates counterclockwise around a low pressure system, as this starts to move, it begins to push it this way with the pressure. Now, the greater the relative difference between the temperature here on the backside and the temperature here in the warm sector, the more deep this low will get, the stronger this storm system will get. And as this cold front starts to move, as you get this cold advection of the temperatures, you'll have a very large pressure gradient and a very large temperature gradient, which will make that storm lift that warm air significantly faster. When you get the lifting of this warm air as this cold air slides underneath it, you will get storm systems that pop up all along the front of this cold front. Because this warm air is being lifted up, it is condensing into clouds, and then it's beginning to rain, produce thunderstorms, lightning, tornadoes, the whole 9 yards. On the upper portion, over here, you also have warm air that's moving this direction, but it's coming over the top of cold air, because remember, this whole area right here is cold air. So it's coming up over the top of this, and it's basically producing rain or snow or whatever it is, depending on the time of the year, right there in a process that is called overrunning. It's not usually as strong as these storms down here because there's not as much lift, but it does produce some storms here. Now, as this continues to move, it will eventually occlude as the pressure down at the surface aligns with the low pressure aloft. So when the storm first forms at the 500 millibar level, which is a more or less halfway up the troposphere, the low pressure at the surface is usually east of the actual 500 millibar low. So as it continues to move closer, once those are aligned, it will begin to fall apart, the low pressure system itself. But as this continues to move, this cold front swings down this direction, more storms will be produced the deeper this low gets. The more you have a difference between here and here, the deeper this low will get in temperature. Which, if we go back to our map of the United States, makes complete sense because down here in the Gulf of Mexico, you have a ton of warm, moist air that after winter is now moving this direction. In addition, you have a ton of cold air in the early spring that's moving this direction, and they meet here in Tornado Alley and produce massive supercells and thunderstorms and all of that. That makes sense. The problem becomes, why specifically over the Great Lakes do you have such strong storms in November? Well, let's zoom in on our Great Lakes here real quick and think about something. So, if you're looking at this map, right, and you're trying to figure out why exactly would we have strong storms in November but not strong storms in the spring? Because if you watch storms in the spring that come over, Wisconsin and Minnesota, this area right here, and continue east, as soon as they move over Superior or Michigan or Huron, the storms tend to fall apart. And there is a reason for that. There's also a reason that it's so much stronger in November. If you think about it, the area where the Great Lakes sit is very cold in the wintertime. It's just straight up, it's very cold. There's no doubt about it. So, water takes a long time to both heat up and lose temperature. So, in the springtime, as these storms are following along, if you've got your low up here and you've got your warm front over here and you've got your cold front starting to occlude and you're over here and it moves over Lake Superior in March, that water of Lake Superior is going to be very cold. So it has lost its warm air that's pushing it up to continue producing storms, and that's why they tend to fall apart in the early spring over Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. But with the Great Lakes, in November, it's had all summer for the Superior and Michigan and Huron and Erie and Ontario to warm up. And because it takes a while for those temperatures in the lakes to cool off for wintertime, it produces, you get your low, you get your cold front down here, like so, and then you get your warm front across the front like this. We're just not even going to talk about occluding at this point. You get your warm air, and as soon as it hits the lakes, it gets even more warm, moist air because the lakes have been heating up all summer. They're losing temperature at a slower rate than the actual ground is itself. So the lakes themselves are pushing up more warm, moist air to produce stronger storms and help to deepen this low, because even though it might only be, 60 degrees over Lake Superior or Lake Michigan, it's going to be in the 20s back behind over here. So if it's 60 degrees in here and it's 60 degrees over Lake Superior, but it's 20 degrees back behind this cold front, that is a massive temperature difference, which is going to help deepen that low and make this storm even stronger. In addition, if you go to, Lake Superior or Lake Michigan or Lake Huron in November and sometimes even early December, if you stand on top of a hill, it's going to be incredibly cold. It's going to be, 20, 30 degrees. But if you walk down to the edge of Lake Superior, it's going to be 10, 15 degrees warmer just because of the heat that's leaving from the lake itself. So the actual lakes themselves in November are providing the fuel for these storms because it takes so long for all of that heat to dissipate. So let's talk about the actual storm systems themselves, and we're going to look at some upper air maps from the time in question. This one in particular is from November 6th, 1913. This is from before the first storm forms, and there's a couple things on here that I want you to pay attention to. Number one is this right here. This is a high-pressure system that's sitting over northern Virginia, Maryland, and parts of southern Delaware. Now, the reason this high-pressure system is so important is because winds around high-pressure system blow clockwise and out. Whoops. Like such. That's a really bad arrow, but you get the picture. Like such. And what this means is because this is sitting over here, this is going to pull warm, moist air that's down here over the Gulf of Mexico, and it's going to push it northward towards the Great Lakes. So in addition to the already warmer, moister air comparatively to what's coming down from Canada, you have even more that's being pulled northward to combine with the air already here to provide the storm system that's going to come through plenty of available fuel. The other thing you need to look at is up here in southern Canada, northern United States. We have 3 low-pressure systems right here that are sitting in that general area, and these 3 low pressure systems are going to move this general direction. So that is November 6th, 2013. The next map we're going to look at is November 7th, 2013. Now, if you look at this map, you still have your high pressure system. It is kind of falling apart just a little bit, but it's still here off the coast, and it's going to be pulling some air up this direction in front of. Now, instead of those 3 low-pressure systems, we have 1 low-pressure system here. Now, if you look at this and you realize you have your winds blowing this direction, And with your low pressure system, you have your winds blowing this direction. So occasionally you'll get an area here in this middle that has some extreme winds with it. This low pressure system has moved south of Lake Superior. This is storm number 1. So on Lake Superior itself, our winds are going to be blowing generally out of the east on the north side of this low. And then over here, you're going to be blowing out of the north, out of the west, and then out of the south, right? So as this low pressure system moves this direction, because if you look at, so the way low pressure systems move is they don't really actually move. They more or less reconstitute themselves in newer locations following the area of greatest pressure change. So if you have a low pressure system and on the front side you have a pressure fall in this area of say like -1 millibar per hour, and on the south portion you have it falling -0.5 millibar per hour, it's going to move in the direction of the greatest pressure change over time. So when looking at a map, if you want to try and figure out where your low pressure system is going to move towards, if you figure out where the greatest pressure change is down lower in the last several hours, that will give you a good idea of where your low pressure system will move in the coming hours. So this system is currently sitting south of Lake Superior, November 7th, 1910. It is going to continue to move eastward, and we're going to have some gale force winds on Lake Superior and then into Lake Michigan as well on the 7th. All right, so now we are on November 8th. The big thing I want you to note here is the low pressure system that was sitting over here in the UP of Michigan is now centered over western Lake Huron. So you have northerly winds here, easterly winds here, southerly winds here, and westerly winds here. Now, that is going to provide very strong wind conditions over Lake Superior up in here. And at this time, one of the ships on Lake Superior, the LC Waldo, would have been trying to take shelter in the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula, which I've covered up with my arrow right here, but is right there, and it has crashed into a rock called Gull Rock that is just off the end of the Keweenaw Peninsula. We'll talk here in just a minute about. In addition, the other thing I want you to note is this high-pressure system that was over northern Virginia and Maryland is now up here off the coast of Newfoundland and Maine and all of that. In addition, you can sort of see the beginning of our next storm down here in North Carolina and South Carolina. This is going to be the area that our second storm is going to produce, and because of this storm here that's going to move off this direction, this area right here is obviously going to be your area of greatest pressure change. So the storm that forms down this direction is going to move basically due northward and bring storm conditions to Lake Huron. So if we look at our next map here, let me erase this real quick. If we look at our next map here for November 9th, our previous storm has moved off this direction. We now have a new storm centered over Virginia currently when this was done on November 9th, and it's moving this direction. This is bringing hurricane force winds to Lake Erie, as well as straight down the entirety of Lake Huron, as well as straight down the entirety of Lake Michigan, and bringing some storm conditions to eastern Lake Superior. Now, we move forward again another day to November 10th. Now, our storm system is centered over western Lake Ontario, eastern Lake Erie, right over Erie, Pennsylvania, which is right about here. This is bringing incredibly strong hurricane force winds directly down both Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, which is going to be a major problem because all of those winds have the complete opening of the lakes to blow down. There's nothing stopping. There's no friction. There's very little friction on open water for winds, so they can continue to build and build and build. But also, the entire length of the lake is called the fetch. It's basically they can travel all the way down the entire length and build up waves and build up waves. In fact, there was so much wind blowing down Lake Huron that this area down here in southern Lake Huron had an additional 3 to 4 feet of water raised up that caused flooding from Lake Huron being blown into the actual shores of the lake. Now we move into November 9th, and November 9th is when the second storm really started to pick up. Now, in the early morning hours of November 9th, they started to believe that the actual storm itself had moved on, right? They had that first storm move in, the gales had started to back off significantly, wind speeds had dropped down to like 40 miles an hour versus 65 to 75 miles per hour sustained, so they kind of felt like they were in the back end of it, which made it bad, but not nearly as bad as it was about to be. So, if you see here, you have your low pressure system that we had just talked about had started to build is now moving northward. It is currently centered over Virginia, Maryland, where that high pressure originally was. You can see the high pressure up here. The other storm had moved off this direction, away from the area of the Great Lakes. This storm here is going to move northward and cause major issues on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, because if you remember, in the previous portion we talked about on November 8th, where wind was blowing down the entire length of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The same thing is going to happen here, except the storm is going to be significantly closer, and that means that the actual winds themselves are going to be significantly stronger. So if we go to November 10th here, you can see the center of the storm right here over western Lake Ontario, eastern Lake Erie. Erie, Pennsylvania is right here, and the winds are just blowing straight down Huron and straight down Lake Michigan. Now, the majority of our shipwrecks are going to be on Lake Huron. Actually, the majority of them are going to be on the southern end of Lake Huron right here, which you can't really see because I've got it covered up with all these drawings, but the southern end of Lake Huron right in this general area where they attempted to take shelter from this storm. Unfortunately, all of the wind on the backside of this low is going to be coming straight at them and is going to cause the majority of the disasters we're about to talk about. So the first ship we're going to talk about is the LC Waldo. Now, this is the first ship we're going to talk about because it is one of the more interesting stories that happened during the White Hurricane. So the LC Waldo, as you can see here, was a Great Lakes freighter that carried iron ore up and down Lake Superior. On November 7th, 1913, she left Two Harbors, Minnesota, to carry a full load of iron ore to Cleveland, Ohio. Now, a couple things to note about specifically Great Lakes freighters. Number one, the pilot house is on the front. You can see it right there. The engine is in the back. So the actual captain is up here in the front, and there is a basically a telegram that he changes how much and which direction power he wants. From here, it corresponds back here in the engine room and allows them to change speeds. Full ahead, half ahead, full stop, the whole 9 yards. Now, the LC Waldo left Two Harbors, Minnesota on November 7th. You can see Two Harbor, Minnesota is right there. So this is Lake Superior. Let's zoom out here real quick. We're on Lake Superior. On November 7th, left Two Harbors, Minnesota right there, bound for Cleveland, Ohio, which is, if you don't know, way down here on Lake Erie. Let's zoom out a little bit. So their trek was from here, cross Lake Superior, down through the Sioux Locks, down through Lake Huron, down through the St. Clair River, down to Cleveland, Ohio, is their trip for this particular story. Now, spoiler alert, they would not make it to Cleveland, Ohio. In fact, they would barely make it across Lake Superior. So, on the morning of November 7th, real quick, let's check our weather maps. So, on the morning of November 7th, you have your low pressure system here, and they are leaving from right here. So at the time, winds would have been directly in their face, coming directly at them. So they leave Two Harbors, are traveling across Lake Superior. this direction. Almost as soon as they get out of Two Harbors, they run into stormy conditions and decide to continue on this direction. Now, their plan is on the evening of November 8th, or November 7th into November 8th, the morning of November 8th, is they are planning on making it around this peninsula right here. This is the Keweenaw Peninsula. Their plan is to get into the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula and attempt to hide and take shelter from the winds that are currently hitting them. Because as they travel across, we look at November 8th, the low pressure system in the 8th is now off to their east. And so, if you look at this map, the winds are blowing this direction because they're on the back side of the low. So, if they get into the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula, if the winds are blowing this direction, if they can get around here, they'll have all of this land right here to block some of the wind and some of the waves. It'll still be bad, but it won't be nearly as bad because they are on the backside of this. So their plan is to get through this portion of Lake Superior, hook around, and come down here. The problem was, because of where they were located with the wind, it's all coming directly at them. So as they're traveling along into the morning of November 8th, they are coming along this direction. The ship gets hit by a massive wave, right? And it completely eliminates this upper pilot house here, completely blows it off of the ship. The captain is inside the pilot house and barely hangs on and has to go down into the lower pilot house and bring a map as well as a compass and a lantern, and is guiding them around the edge of the Keweenaw Peninsula, literally by lamplight and a map that he has stuck to an actual chair and is trying to see and guide them that way. Now, as they come around the Keweenaw Peninsula, unfortunately, they begin to have some issues. Basically, they're guiding half of a ship. They can only see the half portion of the ship. As they're coming around, there is a rock right there. We'll look at it on satellite. Gull Rock now has a lighthouse on it. 1913 did not have a lighthouse on it. They're coming around. As they're coming around, they continue to get hit by waves and it's starting to freeze. The ship starts to break in half. So, everyone from the back of the ship, in the engine room and the crew quarters, which were also in the back of the ship, comes across the front of the ship to the windlass room, which is in this general area of the ship itself. 2 men stay back in the engine room, full speed ahead, and they basically decide to try and get around the corner. The problem was they couldn't see anything. They couldn't steer. Everything was frozen. It was the middle of the night. It was in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. So they are moving full speed ahead, trying to get around the edge of this peninsula and plow directly into this rock, right? Come full speed directly into this rock. It cracks the ship in two, and they begin to realize, we're going to lose the ship into the depths of Lake Superior. So the captain makes the decision with the 2 men back in the engine room to just ram the ship as far up onto Gull Rock as they possibly can, so that if the back half of the ship breaks off, the front half of the ship is stuck up on the actual rock itself. So they do that. They manage to ram the ship up into the rock, and they full speed ahead shove the bow of the ship up as far as they possibly can onto the ship. But the problem is, if we zoom back out here, so we'll just go ahead and zoom all the way out. Just remember where Gull Rock is. It's right in this area right here. Now, if they are still on the back half of, whoops, zoomed out too far here. If they are still on the back half of, Gull Rock is right about there. If they are on the back half of this low and the winds are coming out this direction, you'll notice there is nothing, simply nothing in this area to block the wind and the waves. And they are on the western half of Gull Rock. So they're continuously going to be pounded by wind, waves, and snow. So in an attempt to save themselves, because they've wedged themselves up enough on the rock in order to be able to, hopefully not fall off, they decide to all go into the windlass room. The captain, everyone aboard the ship ends up in the front portion of this ship here. So everyone aboard the LC Waldo makes a mad dash into the windlass room in the front portion of this ship right here. Everyone in the engine room, all 22 people and one dog aboard the ship make it into this front room. Now, the problem becomes the heat that was being supplied to the bottom portions of the ship was running through a pipe that ran from the back of the ship, because that's where all the power is, into the front of the ship. And it cracked when the ship itself cracked in half. So now they are stuck in this room on a rock that has no one on it. No one knows where they are because they're in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of one of the worst snowstorms to hit the Great Lakes. They are trapped. They cannot go anywhere. They now have no heat, no power, nothing. So what they decide to do is, in this portion of the ship, they begin tearing off pieces of wood, because the interior of the ship was all made out of wood. They began tearing off pieces of wood. One of the crew members goes into the captain's quarters and rips the tub out of the wall and carries it to the windlass room. They flip the tub over. They get the fire buckets, basically metal buckets. They kick the bottoms out of the buckets. They line them up with the hole for the drain on the tub, and they make themselves a chimney out one of the portholes here and begin burning wood inside the tub, inside their makeshift fireplace, to make themselves warm. As they do that, they alternate who is in front of the fire. So people that are in front of the fire warm up, and then the people who are not in front of the fire go into the back portion of the windlass room and run, basically do exercises to keep themselves warm until it is their turn to go in front of the fire. And they just rotate that for the next however long they end up being trapped inside this ship. All right, so the crew of the Waldo, 22 men, 2 women, and a dog, are trapped inside the windlass room. They currently have a makeshift fireplace that is burning, but they have basically no food. They can keep themselves warm for as long as they have material to burn, but the ship is basically turning into a giant block of ice, and no one knows where they are because, again, it's the middle of the night in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, so no one should be coming past. The lucky thing is, another freighter was in fact coming past and saw the distress symbol, the distress flag on the LC Waldo up in the air. So that ship comes around the back side of the Keweenaw Peninsula and comes down and manages to get a hold of the Eagle Harbor Life-Saving Station, which is the precursor to the Coast Guard. So they were the lifesavers, and then they were the Coast Guard. And the motto for the lifesavers at this time was, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back, which is honestly an incredibly hard slogan. Like, that's just wild. So, the problem with this is they are currently trapped in a ship. It is the middle of the night, and it is incredibly windy, 70-mile-an-hour winds, 30-foot waves, blinding snowstorm, the whole 9 yards. In addition, they have to get from Eagle Harbor all the way to Gull Rock, which is about 24 miles. That's if they're on a straight path. Obviously, they're not, so let's add a little bit of an angle here. So at best, we're looking at about 25 miles for them to get from Eagle Harbor to Gull Rock in the middle of a blinding snowstorm with 70-mile-an-hour winds and incredibly strong waves. The issue is that there were 2 boats at Eagle Harbor. The longest was 36 feet long, but it was having engine problems. They couldn't get it out onto the lake, so they decided to go out in the smaller boat. That wasn't a good idea. Again, 30-foot waves. So they get going anyway because, again, you have to go out, but you don't have to come out. They make it 8 miles into the weather before they have to turn back because the ship literally stopped moving because it became a block of ice. So they're chipping the engine out of the ice as they're going back to the station. All of the men are basically frozen to their seats. They have nothing that they can do. They're not going to make it. So they turn around and go back to Eagle Harbor. They made it. So they're leaving here. They made it to here, give or take, approximately, before they realize this isn't going to happen. We have to turn around and go back. So they get back. They decide we got to fix the bigger boat. So they start working on it. They also let another life-saving station that was further down the actual peninsula know that they needed someone else to try and make it while they tried to fix their boat. So the next life-saving station that was down from where Gold Rock was the Portage life-saving station, which was located right here on the northern side of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Now, again, they were going to have the exact same problem as the Eagle Harbor life-saving station because, again, they have to go from here out onto the lake all the way over here. Now, a direct line is 45 miles, but again, obviously can't take a direct line. So you've got to go all the way around, and at best it's going to be a 54-mile travel. They realized we can do this differently because if they take this route, they're going to be directly into the teeth of the wind and the waves and the snowstorm. So instead of going this direction, they decide instead to have a towboat that happened to be nearby, tow them, clear the measurement here, tow them down the Portage Canal this way and out onto the lee side of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and then go up this direction. Now, that's going to be longer. That's a much longer distance, right? Because you have to go through the whole canal, you have to come back out, and then go up. And it's going to be better because it's going to be blocked by a lot of the wind, but it's going to be easier than it would be going around the north route. So that's what they decided to do. And they were successful. They managed to get around through the canal, up the Keweenaw Peninsula to Gold Rock. But it would take a significant amount of time. By the time they were dispatched and got to Gold Rock, it had been 14 hours. For those inside the LC Waldo, it had been 92 hours being stuck on that rock inside of a frozen ship. When they arrived on site, it was basically just a giant block of ice. You could barely tell that it was even a ship. Now, they managed to get aboard. One of the men from the life-saving crew took off his shoes because he was wearing wool socks, and he figured that his wool socks would stick to the ice on the LC Waldo better than, walking in his shoes. So he used his wool socks as stick to be able to get to the windlass room where everyone was. They had to literally take ice picks and chip them out of the room and then lower them by rope onto the lifeboats in order to escape from the LC Waldo. In the end, all 22 men, 2 women, and the dog aboard the LC Waldo would survive the White Hurricane. They would spend 92 hours trapped inside the Waldo with essentially no ship, basically relying on whatever they could rip off the walls in order to burn. Everyone aboard both the Eagle Harbor life-saving crew and the Portage life-saving crew were awarded a medal by the Department of the Treasury for their incredible bravery going out into the storm. It would eventually take about a year for the LC Waldo to be pulled off of Gold Rock, but it would eventually be pulled off, refurbished, rebuilt, and then would return to the lakes as a ship called the Riverton. Unfortunately, that will be our only positive ending story for this particular disaster. The next ship we're going to talk about, actually it's going to be 2 ships, are the Charles S. Price and the SS Regina. Now, the reason that we're going to talk about these two together is these 2 ships are mysteriously linked throughout the time since this disaster. So the SS Regina was a Great Lakes freighter that was heading out from Point Edward, Ontario, which is just on the other side of the St. Clair River, headed north from Lake Huron with a mixed load to drop off at several different ports. Now, if we look at the map of Lake Huron, we zoom way out here. So this is Lake Huron right here in the middle. Big one right here in the middle. This is Lake Huron. We are looking at this southern portion right here in particular. So we're going to zoom in. Whoops, eraser. We're going to zoom in down here on the southern portion of Lake Huron. So Point Edward is right here. This is on the eastern side of the St. Clair River. This is the St. Clair River right here. You can hopefully see St. Clair, Michigan. If we zoom out here on the map, and you can see Lake St. Clair right there. We zoom back up. So the Regina left, it's named after Regina, Saskatchewan. So that is the correct way to pronounce it. Just fun fact. So if we, leaving here, headed upbound this direction. The last place the Regina is successfully seen by another freighter is about even with Harbor Beach, Michigan, right here, just off the thumb, as we like to call it, of Michigan. At this point on November 9th, the wind is blowing basically out of the northeast as the low has moved just to the east of Lake Huron. So they're being hit by 70, 75 mile an hour winds, 25 to 35 foot waves, the whole 9 yards. And it is running the entire length of Lake Huron. So these waves are getting to be massive. So at this point, the captain of the Regina decides that they need to turn around and head for safety. So at some point, they attempt to turn around and start heading back southward. The last known place that the SS Regina may have been successfully seen is right here just off the coast of Lexington, Michigan, somewhere in this general area. There are witness statements from Lexington, Michigan saying that they saw a freighter that was anchored off the coast on the evening of November 9th, and then it was gone the next morning. No one knows if it was successfully or likely the Regina. It probably was the Regina because, spoiler alert, that's where the wreck of the Regina was found. However, it could have been another, probably not, but it could have been. Now, when the Regina's wreck was found, it was found in all stop. The telegram in the pilot house was all stop. The telegram in the engine room was all stop. One of the lifeboats had been successfully launched. One of the lifeboats for the Regina would be found with all of the men inside the lifeboat dead. And it would be found, so basically the ship was found with its anchor chain pulled completely taut to the northeast, which makes sense if you think about it. So if they drop the anchor, the winds are blowing from the north or the northeast. It's going to push the boat towards the southwest, right? So your anchor chain is going to be pulled taut towards the northeast, which indicates that they likely had successfully put down their anchor, but were being dragged along by the force of the wind and the waves, and the anchor simply wasn't strong enough to put them in place. Now, what likely happened to the Regina is it probably ended up shifting into the trough of the waves. So if we pull up my handy-dandy whiteboard here, and we hide our map. Let me erase my thing here. So if you've got your waves coming at you, right? You got a wave, 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 wave. Now let's draw a boat. The boat, you want your boat to be like this, right? A long ways. So if this is the bow and this is the stern, right? You want your ship to be going away from the waves or into the waves because you are not having the chance of rolling over, right? If you get sideways, like so, where your bow is facing towards you, basically like if you're looking directly at the ship, you've got the waves hitting the side of the ship and it starts that rolling motion. And once you get that rolling motion, you can't get your ship back out of it because the waves in the Great Lakes are coming so quickly, 1 to 2 seconds in between a wave, that you're going to start rolling and the waves are going to start breaking over the side of the deck and you're going to take on a whole bunch of water and it's going to start sloshing towards the side. Once you get so much water in the ship and it starts, so if you get water that's coming up over the top of the ship, here, let me just erase this. So if you've got your ship here, like so, and you've got your waves coming like this, and you're in the trough of this wave, as the water comes across, it's going to break across the top of the ship, right? And it's going to hit on this side, and it's going to roll your ship this direction, right? Your roll is going to be this direction with the waves, right? Now, you've got your water coming in, and if it manages to get down into your hold, it's not going to be sitting across like that, where you're going to have even weight across. As your ship is rolling, all of this water is going to slosh to one side. So all of your weight is going to be on this side here. And so you're going to roll even more. And eventually you're going to end up with so much water inside that your ship's not going to be able to recover from that roll, and it's going to roll all the way over and sink down. Now, that is very possibly what ended up happening to the Regina, is they ended up in a roll in the trough of the waves that they couldn't get out of, and it eventually sank, with at least some of the men still aboard the Regina. But what does that have to do with the Charles S. Price? Well, at around the same time, the Charles S. Price was also headed upbound on Lake Huron, and at the same time, just a little while after the Regina was seen, the Price was seen by the same, or a little while before, the Price was seen by the same ship up here north of Harbor Beach. The Price, at some point, likely also turned around and started headed back south towards the safety of the St. Clair River, because, again, still northward, but if you're in the river and you sink, you have a much better chance of surviving and making it to a shoreline than you do in the middle of Lake Huron, because Lake Huron's really big. Comparatively, the St. Clair River is relatively small. So, at some point, the Price turns around and starts heading southward. Now, here's where things end up a little confused, and why this is such a mystery, and why the Regina and the Price are linked for basically ever. On the morning of November 10th, a ship was found floating upside down in Lake Huron, somewhere right around in this general area, right? Was found floating upside down with the bow sticking out. So if we look at this portion that's sticking out right here is the bow of the ship. Now, the reason that the bow of the ship is sticking out and not the rest of the ship is because the stern, like most Great Lake freighters at this time, had the engine in the back of the ship and the pilot house in the front, which means the stern of the ship automatically has more weight. You're going to have your weight from your load all the way across. It's supposed to be even all the way across, but you're going to have more weight in the back because that's naturally where the engine is. So whenever this ship, spoiler alert, it's the Price, the Price flipped over, it began floating with the bow sticking out because all of the weight of the load, as it flipped over and filled with water, slid to the back. In addition, the engine dragged it along the bottom of the lake. So as the ship is bobbing along before it eventually entirely sank, the stern is smashing against the ground and just kind of floating along. So on the morning of November 10th, the ship showed up, this ship that no one knew who it was floating along, and they believed it was the Regina based on what was actually sticking up out of the water. They couldn't tell because it was basically a frozen solid hunk of ice, as well as most of it was below the water of Lake Huron, and the storm was still going on at the time. It would take until November 17th for a diver to dive down along the edge of the ship and discover that it was actually the Charles S. Price. Now, these two ships sank in a relatively similar location. They're both on that eastern side of on the eastern side of Michigan in Lake Huron in that southern portion, and were heading in the similar direction. And because of that, a lot of the debris for both of them ended up washing up on the shores of Lake Huron on the Canadian side in this general vicinity. They were kind of mixed together, a combination of the actual loads, the debris from the ships being damaged, personal effects of the sailors bodies themselves regularly washed up along the eastern shore of Lake Huron in Canada. Now, when that happened, a lot of the farmers and the people that lived in this area grabbed things from the ships and took them back. Canadian officials threatened them with 3 years of jail time for anyone that was found in possession of debris from the wrecks from the storm. So a lot of them just returned it to the beaches and tossed it. And that's where our confusion comes in, because one of the crew members from the Charles S. Price was found wrapped in a life jacket that was labeled SS Regina. That indicated that at some point during the storm, the Price and the Regina came across each other. However, the wording of the finding of the body doesn't say that he was wearing the life jacket. It just says he was wrapped in the life jacket. Others say the life jacket was laying on top of him. So it's possible that someone over here in Canada had found one of the life jackets for the Regina, wanted to return it, and just tossed it on the first body they found. It's not like they would know that the man that was laying dead on the beach was a member of the wrong crew. They just tossed it where it would look, okay, man died in a wreck, he's going to have a life jacket, we'll just toss it on top of him. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility that he just became wrapped up in it in the natural movement of the water across Lake Huron. That's also a possibility. Seems incredibly unlikely. Would be a very, very extreme coincidence, but it is also a possibility. The other possibility is that one of the ships foundered first. The other ship, still floating, managed to rescue some of the members of the Regina or the Price, and then either the Regina or the Price sank later. It's most likely that the one that sank first would be the Regina, because it was a little further north than where the Price was. The issue with that is that it's been proven, based on the damage to the Price's hull, that it smacked against the ground in Lake Huron. So it's possible the Price sank north of where the Regina was and then continued to travel further south as the wind and the waves pushed it further south after it had already wrecked. So it's possible that the Price wrecked somewhere up here north of where the Regina was found, and then the Regina traveling by picked up members of the Price, and then the Regina sank down here. Or the Regina sank down here, members of the Regina were in the water, the Price came by, picked them up, and then ended up sinking a little further south. Either one is possible. Now, the most likely is that somebody found the Regina's life jacket and just tossed it on the first dead body they found. That seems to be the most likely. The one that I personally like the most is that the two members of the crew managed to find each other and rescue each other and sacrifice their lives attempting to save their fellow mariners. Our next ship is the Isaac Merritt Scott. Now, the Isaac Merritt Scott was basically identical to the Charles S. Price, except this one was carrying coal from Cleveland, Ohio on Lake Erie, bound for Milwaukee, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. The Isaac M. Scott left Cleveland, Ohio early in the morning of November 9th, 1913, and was last seen. So let's look at the map here real quick. So we have... You go down a little bit. There you go. We have Cleveland right here. Traveled up Lake Erie, up the St. Clair River, through Lake St. Clair, up the St. Clair River again, and was traveling north on Lake Huron on November 9th, 1913. Now, last was seen near Tawas City, which is right here in Michigan, in Lake Huron. Was out in this general area, was still headed north directly into the storm itself. The actual ship would be found some 76 odd years later up in the northern portion here. The ship was found upside down and appeared to have been swamped from being struck by a rogue wave. It's still in one piece at the bottom of Lake Huron. Now, all 28 members of the Isaac M. Scott were lost in this disaster, and the only body that was ever found was the captain still wearing his life preserver that washed up on the shores of Lake Ontario. There was only one lifeboat ever found, but it was empty of all crew members. Our next ship is the SS Argus. The SS Argus was also lost on Lake Huron on November 9th, 1913, and was also headed upbound with a load of coal. You'll notice there's a lot of repetitiveness in this particular disaster. Now, the Argus was different from the previous several ships because it broke in two and then sank with all hands. Half of it was found in one area, and half of it was found in another area, with both portions of the ship lying upside down in approximately 250 feet of water. None of the men from the Argus's bodies have ever been found. Our next ship is the SS Hydrus. The Hydrus was the sister ship of the Argus, the previous ship we just talked about, and the Hydrus also sank on Lake Huron. It was headed south towards the safety of the St. Clair River when it suddenly sank on or around November 8th into November 9th. It is currently sitting in about 160 feet of water. It is one piece. However, it is twisted in a weird 45-degree angle. So the hull is damaged, but the bow portion of the ship, the front portion of the ship, is twisted at a 45-degree angle from the rest of the ship. It is believed that it likely swamped due to a very large wave on Lake Huron. It had 24 people aboard. All 24 men died in the sinking. 5 of the crew were frozen to death inside a lifeboat that washed ashore in Canada in the days after the disaster. Our next ship is one of those mysteries of the Great Lakes, that especially of the White Hurricane, that continues to be talked about to this day. This is the story of the Henry B. Smith. Now, the Smith was in Marquette, Michigan, which is on the Upper Peninsula, on November 6th, 1913, taking on a load of iron ore. The problem was, on that day, the first of the storms started to arrive and began to drop the temperature in the area of Marquette down to well below freezing. This caused the iron ore that they were picking up inside the hopper cars to freeze together, and the men loading the Smith had to knock them apart by hand, which delayed the loading of the Smith significantly until November 8th. The issue was, throughout the entirety of the 1913 shipping season, the Henry B. Smith had been beset by delays and crashes and all those kinds of things. And basically, the captain of the Smith was told by the owners, you need to be on time for the shipment or else. And so, as soon as they finished loading at 5 p.m. on November 9th, the captain backed the ship out of the dock and out into Lake Superior, when it was during a lull between what we now know was the first storm and the second storm. But almost as soon as they got out onto Lake Superior proper, the storm picked up almost immediately with 30-foot waves, 70-mile-an-hour winds. Absolutely incredible strength of this storm, and they were heading out directly into the open water where it would be its strongest. Now, the Smith was supposed to be heading east towards the Sioux Locks, but witnesses in Marquette saw the Smith, instead of turning to the right, they turned toward the left. It is believed that they were attempting to find shelter in, again, the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula. At that point, the ship disappeared from view, and then debris was found 2 days later along several beaches on Lake Superior. Only 2 bodies were ever recovered. One of the cooks was found floating 50 miles west of Whitefish Point, and then one of the men's skeleton was found on Paris Island in the spring of 1914. After they found the body of the third engineer on Paris Island, which is out east of Keweenaw Peninsula, it's out east of Whitefish Point, actually, there was a note in a bottle, allegedly from the Henry B. Smith, that was found in June 1914. The author, of which there was no signature, claimed that the ship had broken in two somewhere near Marquette, but the owners of the boat decided that it was a fake because the note was dated November 12th, while it is believed the Henry B. Smith sank either in the late evening hours of the 9th or the early morning hours of the 10th. Now, the interesting part about this was the Henry B. Smith wreckage was missing forever. It would take until 2013 to finally find the remains of the Henry B. Smith. And in fact, the Henry B. Smith lies in 2 pieces just off the shore of Marquette. And it is upright but broken into in the middle. Now, the cargo is also scattered along the lake bottom, which indicates the writer of the note may actually have been one of the survivors of the Henry B. Smith who put it in the bottle, because the only people that would know that the Henry B. Smith was broken into would be the people that were aboard the actual Henry B. Smith. So it's very possible that this note in a bottle was not a phony at all. It was actually what happened to the Henry B. Smith. Our next ship is the James Caruthers. Now, the Caruthers was a literally brand new ship, had been launched in May of 1913. In fact, many of the crew aboard the ship often complained that the paint inside the ship itself was still tacky when they were sailing, and they were not quite sure how well it would handle the storms of the Great Lakes. On the afternoon of November 9th, 1913, many people along the shore of Lake Huron in Ontario heard steamer whistles and sighted distress rockets far off into the lake. It is believed that those whistles and rockets were the crew of the Caruthers signaling that they were in trouble and needed help. Several of the bodies of the men, all 22 of them, were found wearing heavy coats and life jackets, indicating that they had time to prepare for the sinking of the ship. Now, it was missing for 112 years. It was just found on May 26th of 2025 in 190 feet of water, just about 20 miles east of Harbor Beach, Michigan, which is nowhere near where the Caruthers was last sighted. The Caruthers was last sighted headed due east on Lake Huron towards Canada, because that's where its final destination was, when it was last sighted by the other ship, the J.H. Cheadle, that it had traveled with to that point. Eventually, they had disappeared into the horizon and had somehow been blown approximately 70 miles off course of where they originally planned to be. It is exactly unknown how they ended up so far off course and how they ended up sinking. The ship is again upside down, which likely indicates that they ended up in the trough of some waves and swamped by a large wave. Our next ship is the SS Wexford. It was a steel-hulled cargo ship that was built in 1883. It was significantly smaller than the other Great Lakes ship, and it was carrying approximately 96,000 bushels of wheat on the morning of November 9th, 1913, when it sank in Lake Huron with the loss of all hands. Now, it's unknown exactly how many people were aboard the ship. There have been conflicting reports of between 17 and 24 men. Now, this particular disaster on this particular ship is a little bit different than the others, because there are actually photos of the men from the Wexford washed up on shore. You can see on the life jacket here, you can see where it says Wexford here, and it says Wexford here. Several of the men were found washed up on shore and were buried after the disaster. Now, our next ship is one of the mysteries of the White Hurricane steel. It is the SS Leafield. The SS Leafield was hauling steel rails on Lake Superior when she suddenly sank during the night of November 9th, 1913. The entire crew of 18 died in the disaster. They were lost with all hands, and none of them have ever been found. In addition, the ship itself has still not been found to this day. It has been missing since November 19th, 1913. Now, there are some theories as to where the SS Leafield might be. They were in this general area at the time of the sinking, and it is currently believed that they sank somewhere off of the Angus Islands in this general vicinity. Now, where in this general vicinity, no one has any idea. They haven't been able to find any of the wreck or the debris or anything, but it is believed that this was the last known location for the SS Leafield that we'll hopefully be able to find the remains of here relatively soon, as there are a number of people on the Great Lakes still out searching for the missing wrecks from various disasters throughout the Great Lakes history. Our next ship is the SS Plymouth. Now, the SS Plymouth on the day of November 8th, 1913, was being towed by the tug, the James H. Martin. The Plymouth had a load of cedar posts and was traveling downbound on Lake Michigan towards Menominee, Michigan on Lake Huron. As they were traveling northbound on Lake Michigan, the storm began to get worse and worse, and both ships began to struggle with the increasing wind, wave, and snow. Now, realizing that both ships would sink if they stayed together, the captain of the James H. Martin decided to guide the Plymouth to the safest waters he could find, and then cutting the line and going to find his own safe waters. So he towed them to an area near St. Martin's Island at the mouth of Green Bay, which is on the northwest end of Lake Michigan. I'll pull up the map here in a second. There, once they got there, he cut the line between the Plymouth and the James H. Martin. On board the Plymouth at the time were 6 crew members, 1 captain, and then 1 U.S. Marshal, because the Plymouth was the subject of several lawsuits, and they needed the marshal there to make sure that nothing else bad happened. Now, after they cut the line, the James H. Martin traveled on to Point Detour, which was about 12 miles away from where the Plymouth was, and the Plymouth stayed behind and dropped anchor, intending to ride it out until the tug was able to return once the storm stopped. When the tug returned to where they had left the Plymouth 2 days later, the ship was gone. They couldn't find any remains of it. They couldn't find any bodies. Eventually, 2 days later, the body of the U.S. Marshal washed ashore at Manistee, Michigan, and a note from that U.S. Marshal was discovered 11 days later. That letter reads as follows. Dear wife and children, we were left up here in Lake Michigan by McKinnon, Captain James H. Martin Tug at anchor. He went away and never said goodbye or anything to us. Lost 1 man yesterday. We have been out in storm 40 hours. Goodbye, dear ones. I might see you in heaven. Pray for me, Chris K. P.S. I felt so bad I had another man write for me. Goodbye forever. Now, the wreck of the Plymouth has never been found. It's one of 2 ships that sank during the White Hurricane that has never been found, combined with the lead field. And it is not known exactly what caused the Plymouth to sink, as the only body that was ever found was that of the U.S. Marshal who wrote that note. Now, the captain of the James H. Martin was not arrested or charged or anything for, in the words of the men aboard the Plymouth, abandoning them to the storm so he could seek shelter. And the captain himself claimed that he stayed until he made sure that the Plymouth was riding comfortably in the storm. Why he didn't take the men aboard the Plymouth aboard the Martin, nobody really knows, and he never really explained. In fact, the Martin barely made it through the storms themselves. So it appears that maybe he abandoned them, maybe he didn't. It depends on your predicament. And obviously the men aboard the Plymouth believed that they were abandoned by the Martin to die in the storm. Our last ship to sink with the loss of all hands during the White Hurricane of 1913 was the lightship Buffalo, LV-82. Now, the lightship was more or less a mobile lighthouse. You can see the lighthouse here on top, the light here on top. Basically was used to guide ships on Lake Erie into Buffalo, New York, hence the name Buffalo. And they were stationed in one location off of Point Albino, Ontario. Throughout the entire storm, they stayed in precisely their spot through both storms and eventually sank on an unknown date during the storm with the loss of all 6 crew members. The wreckage was eventually found on May 13th, 1914, just 2 miles from its assigned location. So, throughout this entire storm, the ship remained in place for the most part and only ended up traveling about 10,000 feet from where it was initially assigned during 2 of the strongest storms to ever strike the Great Lakes. That is honestly pretty impressive. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about the surrounding effects of these storms outside of the lakes themselves, because it wasn't just the water and the ships on the lakes that suffered. Several of the cities along the Great Lakes had paralyzing snowstorms. Cleveland, in particular, received 22 inches of just snow with an additional layer of ice. This photo you see here of downed power lines was in Cleveland, Ohio. They were without power for weeks afterwards, and it caused at least a few deaths on land itself. In addition, because of the amount of damage that this particular storm caused, Cleveland decided to move all of their power lines underground, which took about 5 years to complete. In total, across all of the wrecked ships, the lost sailors, the deaths on shore, all of that, there were approximately 250 deaths associated with the White Hurricane. And a lot of that had to do with the lack of warning from the U.S. Weather Bureau that, number one, didn't have the resources, but number two, didn't have the technical knowledge to be able to predict what would happen with this particular storm. They still didn't quite understand warm fronts and cold fronts. They only had a few upper air soundings from the time. It was still a very fledgling organization that was still trying to develop. In the aftermath of this, the funding into the U.S. Weather Bureau became significantly higher because there was an extreme amount of loss in monetary and death from this particular storm, and those on the Great Lakes wanted to be aware of if there were going to be gales in the future so they could tell their ship captains, go out, don't go out, or take this different route so that you have a different path. And it continued. Now there would be significantly more wrecks on the Great Lakes after 1913, up to November 10th, 1975, which was the last Great Lakes freighter to sink on one of the Great Lakes. It was the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's been 50 years since the last major Great Lakes shipping disaster. However, the 1913 White Hurricane was really the catalyst to get things going to the point where we haven't had one happening in the last 50 years. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, you can follow me on all the social medias or here on YouTube or whatever. You are all adults. I appreciate you all for being here. And as always, stay safe and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.